when York Craig has asked me to teach this class, all of a sudden I get this rush of simultaneous feelings. I'm honored, I'm humbled, but most of all, I'm intimidated. I thought about it, and it was sort of like this comparison that came to me. Every Sunday, this class feasts on filet mignon, and today I'm offering you hamburger helper. When York was telling us about his lost Bible, and then he found it, and it reminded me of this tale from my Kosciuszko days. One of my partners, and I don't know if any of you know him, he's a strong Methodist gentleman, Dr. Paul Mink, who is about 20 years older than I am and still going strong. But when we were in practice together, his elderly father at that time, whose name, and I'd never heard this name before, Lafford, L-A-F-F-O-R-D. Well, Lafford Mink and his wife lived on a farm outside Kosciuszko. I think Paul and his wife had moved them closer to them, so he was on this farm outside Kosciuszko, and he had a few cows. Well, he had told Paul that he had lost one of his newborn calves. Well, one day, Paul gets a call at the clinic, and it is Mr. Mink who says, "Paul, I just found that calf." And Paul said, "Well, Dad, how did you find it?" He said, "All of a sudden, Paul, all of a sudden." So I'm sure that's how York feels about his Bible as well now. I've known for a little while that I was going to be teaching today, and this lesson mainly has to do with some thoughts that I've had over the past several weeks, and this is what I want to share with you this morning. Our scripture is from an Old Testament book, Lamentations. And Lamentations 3, this is right after Jeremiah, Lamentations 3, 18 through 24. Lamentations 3, 18 through 24. "So I say, my splendor is gone, and all that I had hoped from the Lord. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore, I will wait for him." Now, several weeks ago, we were all shocked by the murder of the Jackson police detective by the suspect that he was interrogating. According to news accounts, at the funeral of this husband and father, one of the city leaders was quoted in the paper as saying about this, "God doesn't make any mistakes." Now, before that, back in December, on December the 14th of last year, we had the Newtown Elementary School shooting, in which 20 little innocent children were killed and 6 adults. And then, most recently, the Boston Marathon bombing. And I know you've seen his picture on the paper, that beautiful, wide-eyed 8-year-old boy who was killed. And then on the heels of that, the Texas fertilizer plant explosion, in which several heroic first responder firefighters were killed. this past week, on my appointment schedule was a young man that I had seen before for various and sundry minor problems, as well as his wife. He is a chemist. She is a psychologist. Well, I had no real clue about what I was walking into when I opened that door to that exam room. There sat both him and her just in tears and sobbing, and their story was this, that the past Friday night, their little 2-year-old boy, who was this big husky linebacker looking guy, had a little slight fever, and she had given him some Tylenol, and he wanted to snuggle with her in the bed before she put him in his bed, which she let him do, and then she put him in his bed. And she said she checked on him at 8 o'clock. She checked on him at 11. All was well. She checked on him at 3 that morning. And then when she went in to get him out of the bed the next morning at about 7, he was dead. And an autopsy was done, and nothing was really found, so they're calling it a SIDS death, even though that's sort of old for a SIDS death, but all of his organs were perfect. And then she was having all those, what if I'd taken him to the doctor, and all of those things. So it was not a good time. I tried to do what I could to counsel them. But in each of these instances that I mentioned, that phrase, God doesn't make any mistakes, kept coming back to me, but not in a good way. Now, I'm not a theologian, but all of my life I've been unable to reconcile those words, that phrase, with my idea of the God of all creation, with the God that I pray to, with the God who loves me and whom I love. And I'm not asking you to buy into my theology or philosophy, but that's just the way I see it. It just really, when I hear people say things like God doesn't make any mistakes, and you see this wide-eyed 8-year-old boy who had just hugged his father at the end of the Boston Marathon killed, I have trouble buying into that. One of our ministers in Kosciuszko, First United Methodist Church, Brother Johnny Dinas, I don't know if any of you has ever heard of him, but he was of Dinas, that's Greek, and we always said there, when he came to Kosciuszko, if there were any Methodist minister that could have been the Pope, it was he. He had this air about him, and his hair slicked back, and he wrote with a fountain pen that he filled from a bottle of ink. We knew there must be something really special about this man. But he shared an understanding, and I don't know, I'm sure this is out there, but I'd never heard it explained exactly like this before. But it was something that I could buy into. And I've subscribed to this ever since that time that he explained it, about God's will. That first, there was God's intentional will, His absolutely perfect will for each of us. Then comes along God's circumstantial will. And that's when you throw us in the mix, and that intentional will starts getting screwed up. And to me, those incidents that I talked about are those results of that circumstantial will. And then you put those things together in the mix, and we come out with what he termed God's ultimate will. And that has provided comfort to me through the years, to be able to know that my God did not will for that little 2-year-old boy to be found dead in his bed that morning by his parents, that little 8-year-old boy not be killed in that bombing, that those Newtown elementary school students not be shot to death by some crazed gunman. I'm going to read next Romans 8, 18, and then 24 and 25. Romans 8, 18. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. And then 24 and 25. For in this hope we were saved, but hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what he already has? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. Now, during these terrible, tragic events that I spoke of, with loss of innocent lives, that really makes no sense whatsoever, when all hope can seem lost, we often tend to lash out at God and question his motives, his sovereignty, and even his role in our world. Has he forgotten us here? We wonder how we can continue to live in a world that is filled with senseless pain, heartache, and suffering, and still maintain this hope that we are told about in the Bible. We begin to wonder how we can be patient and place our hope in a God we cannot see and his plan that we may not at times understand. First, I would suggest we need to remember just who is in control. When bad things like the deaths of innocents happen around us, we become unsettled since it becomes clear that we are not in control. As a matter of fact, we never were in control to begin with. Our hope is regenerated at times like this when we understand correctly that it is God who is in control and never ceases to be. Second, I would tell you to know that everything that happens is not pleasing to God. To me, that's where the idea of this circumstantial will comes in. Evil, sin, suffering, and pain aren't things that God enjoys, but they exist within the framework of letting us have free will. And we've all, unless you're a very special person living in a glass house, we've all experienced the consequences of poor choices in our lives. It is important to realize that even when pain and suffering occur in our lives from our own negligence or willfulness, God's plan is still secure. Third, I would remind you to remember God's faithfulness. Throughout our lives, and indeed in these remarkable, unthinkable recent events, we find numerous occasions to question God's will, his faithfulness, and his plan for our world that he created. 2 Corinthians 1:4 reminds us that our God is one who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. In other words, we need to think back on God's prior work in our own lives and take time to share His faithfulness with others, especially those whose lives have been turned upside down in an instant. A sovereign God who loves us unconditionally and even has a generous plan for our lives should continue to be our hope all the time, but especially when suffering, pain, and evil cause us to question His purpose. That's pretty good.
You did good.
Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Holy Father, help us to know that You are indeed in control and that we are indeed not in control. Holy Father, when we hear of tragic events that I spoke of, help us to realize that these things did not cause You any happiness or joy. Rather, I can see that they cause You heartache and suffering over mankind. Help us as Your faithful Christian family and your church to reach out to those whose lives have been affected by such insanity and let people know that You are a God of love, that it is not Your intentional will that they have harm come to them. Keep us in the center of Your will. Give us a good church service today. Give us a good, productive week this next week. In Your holy name I pray. Amen.
Amen.